This week on the forum, I read a lot of great questions, and I think I'm going to try to chunk them into four kind of short videos. The first question was mine, and I basically asked everybody if they thought coalitions were temporary and whether they'd experienced them as more or less so. And there were many great responses and posts, too many perhaps to even kind of comment on. Um, but I thought in particular a few were pretty insightful that might help convey to you what I was trying to get at. And those two of them were Mladen and Robert Paul. And Mladen says coalitions might not be completely temporary, but occasionally repetitive. When different issues arise, members of former successful coalitions will join forces again, maybe in different forms than if that coalition never existed at all. And Robert says, it depends on the nature and purpose of the coalition, and he goes on to describe a variety of those cases. And I think both are right. When I began as an academic, I focused on rebellion and resistance in organizations like schools and classrooms. And in those cases, I saw students form coalitions against teachers, or even the teacher formed a coalition with a leading clique of students just in order to get through the lessons, in order to keep people engaged. And in that kind of a small organizational environment, it was even happening. But once they won, the coalition kind of got through, once they got through an issue, the coalition dissolved. But it was interesting. I think Mladen's right, because once they accomplished it once, they saw it as a pathway. That coalition formation was a pathway to continued success. So the next time problems arose, they would form coalitions to resolve them. And so I think there is something to this repetition, as well as to Robert's point, which is that it depends, that some organizations are more likely to have this repetition of a coalition formation. And those are ones where they're kind of have the same participants, and the resources are such that require them to have those repeated kind of decision moments, like a leading coalition in a government can last for a little bit as long as the conditions are right. But in other cases, it's more fluid because the participants quickly churn over, the resources available in the environment change, and so forth. In particular, I also wanted to comment on Richard Seymour's post, which I thought was really neat because he kind of related both how a coalition forms and kind of also how it falls apart. So he first wrote about coalitions forming, and he says, I work in a nonprofit that was managed by a worker collective. People who worked there came for various reasons. Some reasons related to the mission, but sometimes it was because of our democratic work structure. Thinking of our organization as a coalition sheds some light on why things may have worked well for the first several years and why it later started to work not so well. And at the beginning, each person could define the mission of the organization in their own way, so ambiguity about the mission was high. At the same time, we had few resources to spread around, so they needed each other, right? And many of the activities were determined by volunteer initiative. So this led to a lot of inefficiencies, but there was also a lot of excitement about the organization. There was a degree of unity in the group, even though we all had different reasons for being there. So that's what he saw as a successful coalition. And then in contrast, he later writes about how that fell apart. He said, as we began to address the inefficiencies, we needed to clarify the mission. This led to some people's version of the mission taking precedence over other people's version. And the coalition aspect of the organization, where they had found some kind of strange bedfellows situation, began to fall apart. And it began to weaken, and everything, eventually it split, and people got frustrated. So he says, I think in retrospect, we had a coalition anchored in the ambiguity over our mission, and it is by nature a temporary proposition. We're now phasing out the worker collective and establishing a more formal hierarchy as a basis for working collaboratively without a heightened danger of impasse. I think the reason coalitions tend to be temporary is because ambiguity is generally opposed to long-term effectiveness. So I thought that was a nice insight, that coalitions were temporary because they get through a short-term kind of impasse usually, but they don't really have a long-term effectiveness. They're unstable inherently so, and they're a particular kind of organizing where the conditions are right.